Does anybody in here feel like they enjoy waiting for things? I don't think that waiting is something that we do well. I hate waiting. I'm the type of person that I hate when I pick the wrong line at the grocery store. Have you ever done that before, where you're like at Kroger and you're like, you got some options and then you pick the slowest line possible? That happens to me all the time in traffic, right? Where it's like, oh, I'm going to get in this lane and then that lane goes slow. I hate waiting in lines at Disney World. Anybody ever been to Disney before? Some of you have. It's like, wait in line or you're not paying attention. Disney, you wait in lines all the time, or at a water park, things like that. I don't like waiting. There are things that I will wait for. In fact, I will embarrassingly tell you that I have sat in a Steak and Shake parking lot for 15 minutes before I go in to wait until it was happy hour to get my half-price milkshake. It's a smart decision, but mostly waiting is awful. I have waited in the parking lot while my wife runs into Target to get something. It's awful. What's something that is good to wait for? Can anybody tell me something that is worth the wait? A husband, yeah. She's okay. That's good. Was the eclipse worth the wait? It's probably worth the wait, right? At first you're like, oh, that's like, okay, the sun's partly covered. But then once it gets there, the total eclipse was totally worth the wait, right? Anybody else? What's something that's really, it's worth the wait? It's worth the wait. What? Oh, yeah, we're waiting for Move. Totally worth the wait. We have no other choice but to wait, right? Nothing? All right. Some of us are fine with waiting. Probably doesn't bother you as much as maybe it bothers me. Some of us do it well. The problem, I think, lies in is when the waiting seems pointless, right? So, for example, if you walk into like Starbucks or something like that and you order your, what's it, the pink drink, right? Is that what all the ladies like? You order your drink, you order your pink drink, and you make that order, and then, the three people that were in line after you, they get their drink before they make your drink. That just seems like it was pointless, right? I don't know if that's ever happened to you or not, but when you have to wait for something and it seems like there's no reason that you're waiting, it's frustrating, and we can sometimes, here's what I think, we can sometimes feel this in our relationship with God. Because your relationship with God, whether you recognize all the time or not, has a little bit of waiting. You have a little bit of tension and pull in that relationship, and this month, as we've been talking about purpose, we've dove into some of these ideas of your purpose as a teenager, or your purpose in life, right? And so we've said that, part of your purpose is to follow Jesus with everything that you have. And that means to drop things that are in the way, right? So when we looked at the calling of the first disciples and how our purpose is primarily just to follow Jesus and to forget everything else. Last week we talked about the story of Zacchaeus, right? And so we said that, your purpose ultimately, when you have an encounter with Jesus and you follow him, is going to have life change. Your life, your morals, your ethics will change when you follow Jesus truly, and that's a part of your purpose. But what we're going to see tonight is that your purpose in life, whether right now or your ultimate purpose in life, your future, however you want to describe it, sometimes you're going to have to wait on that. Sometimes it's not going to be so clear. Sometimes you're going to be confused, and you'll have to learn how to wait. So that brings us to a really big, important question that we all wonder to start this out. How can I trust God when it's not clear what he's doing? And that, my friends, is the question that is going to be around for the rest of your life. Because the reality is that you are not always going to know what God is up to. In fact, I would say most of the time you're not going to know what he's up to. And so, how can I trust him when I don't know what he's going to do or how this is going to play out, right? Because you're not going to know God's plan for your life. It's going to be revealed in different parts, and sometimes you'll be confirmed, like I feel like I'm living in my purpose that God has for me, but often you're going to feel confused. Where do I go to school? What am I supposed to major in? Am I supposed to date this person? All these type of things. So how can I trust God when I don't know what he's doing or where I'm supposed to go? So you're going to have to learn how to trust the process that God leads you on in this life. And that's what we're going to discover tonight. That's what we're going to talk about. That even when our mind tells us these things that God isn't doing what needs to be done, that we can trust internally that what needs to happen will happen. So, when you don't make the team, or when you get dumped, or if your parents ever got divorced, or when your grandpa passes away, or whatever it is, and all of those things, how can you trust God when you don't know what he's doing? That's what I want to discover with you tonight, because it is so important that you get this. When you understand this, if you could trust God in the waiting, you can be patient for your life purpose. I think that's really what this comes down to. So what I want to do tonight is a little bit different than what we normally do. Usually would have like a couple points for you guys to memorize or things like that. I just want to show you 3 stories in the Bible that show us how we can answer this question, how we can trust God even in the midst of those things, okay? The very first one is from a man named Jairus. And Jairus is a person that's only mentioned briefly in the New Testament, but he's found in a couple of the Gospels. They tell his story. Jairus was a ruler in the synagogue in Capernaum, okay? And so he was a religious leader. People looked up to him. He was well known. He was respected. But his story starts with tragedy. So I want to read to you how it starts in Mark chapter 5. You can turn there in if you brought a physical Bible, Mark chapter 5. But if not, here it is. It says this: Then one of the synagogue leaders named Jairus, he came, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet. He pleaded earnestly with him, "My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live." And so Jesus went with him, and a large crowd followed and pressed around him. And so what we learn about Jairus from the other Gospels that tell this story is that his daughter was 12 years old, and she'd become deathly ill and was on her deathbed. And he comes to Jesus in hopes that he'll do something, that he'll save her life. Maybe he'd heard about Jesus and heard about all the cool things and the miracles and the healings that he had done. Now, mind you, remember this, most religious leaders actually didn't like Jesus. And they ridiculed him, and they tried to trap him and things like this. But Jairus, as a synagogue leader, comes to Jesus for help. But here's the problem. After Jairus gives this request, and Jesus says, "Yes, I will come," and he starts to go with Jairus, he gets distracted. In fact, the story goes that as Jesus was going with Jairus, he felt someone touch his coat. And apparently Jesus knew that power had left him, because this woman who had been sick for over a decade touched his coat, believing that she would be healed when she touched just a part of Jesus' clothes. And it was true. She was instantly healed. But Jesus, he couldn't let the moment just pass. He was like, "Who touched me? I know that my power left me. Who touched me?" His disciples were like, "Jesus, like, there's a whole crowd here. It could have been anybody." He's like, "No, I know that someone touched me." And so he found this woman and says, "Your faith has healed you." And there's this whole story. And it's kind of a really cool moment. But remember why Jesus was walking through the crowd. It was to help Jairus and his daughter. That's where the story goes a little south, because as this happened, I want you to think about this for a second. I skipped over this. As this happens, what do you think is going through Jairus' mind, right? I mean, he's come to Jesus and basically said, "My daughter is dying, can you come help?" And all of a sudden, Jesus gets distracted with something else. Jairus is probably thinking and feeling, was my request not as important? Or is it not as urgent? Maybe it wasn't the most important thing to Jesus in that moment. I just have to ask a question. Have you ever felt that in your life too? Where maybe you've prayed for something, or you've asked God for something, or you believe, "Man, I need an answer for this about this part of my life," or whatever it is, because maybe you don't have like someone that you love that's sick and dying, like urgent like that, but maybe you've got something in your life that you've asked God and you need an answer, and it just felt like maybe it wasn't the most important thing to God. You just felt like you didn't get the answer that you needed. And I feel like, because I'm saying this because I know that it's true for my life, that sometimes we can feel those things. Sometimes we can feel like we bring these requests to God, and it just doesn't feel like it was the most important thing to be solved. Most of you probably don't know this, but when my wife and I, Shelby, when we were trying to have kids, we had a really difficult time to have children. It was not easy for us. And so we spent a lot of time visiting doctors and doing different types of treatments and things like that, and tests, things like that. And it was a very trying time for us because we felt like, really, we wanted to be parents, and we prayed about this over and over and over again, and it just obviously didn't happen for in our time what we wanted. And so it was trying for us because we felt like we were taking these requests to God and it just wasn't being answered. Well, in the midst of that, my sister, who is 4 years younger than I am, gets pregnant accidentally. She wasn't even married, wasn't even trying to have kids. Well, you know how that works, but she wasn't trying to become a parent. And so we shared this news, like, I'm having a kid, just an accident. And we just felt like it wasn't like anything that she did. She wasn't trying to hurt us, but it just felt like a jab, right? Because here we are presenting our request to God and asking him, and then here something else happens that just seems to be like, well, that's not what they wanted. And so all of these things, I share that just to tell you that in life sometimes this happens, where you take something to God and it just feels like maybe it's not that important. I think Jairus probably felt this way as Jesus is asking who touched him in the crowd, and he's like, Jesus, my daughter is dying. Why are you wasting your time here? And here's how this gets even worse. Look at verse 35. While Jesus was still speaking, some people came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue leader. Your daughter is dead, they said. Why bother the teacher anymore? What if Jesus hadn't been distracted? What if he ran with Jairus? Why did this have to happen this way? Those are the questions that I think are probably running through Jairus' mind, or even the people in the crowd. Everyone is thinking something like this, but look what we read in the next verse. Overhearing what they said, Jesus told them, don't be afraid, just believe. It just sounds such like a Jesus thing, right? Don't be afraid, just believe. But the rest of the story, if you're familiar with the story, you know how it goes. Jesus shows up into the house. He heals and heals this daughter. She gets up out of the bed and everybody's rejoicing because they thought she was dead and now she's alive. And all of this to say, it's this miraculous story is that even when we feel like God didn't have a plan, or that he was distracted, or maybe it wasn't that important, he came through, and ultimately in the end, Jesus and God were glorified because of what happened. And I think that can happen in our stories sometimes as well. Sometimes in life, it's going to feel like God's timing is detrimental to us. It didn't happen how we wanted it to. It didn't happen on our timing, but we often have to remember that God works on his own perfect timing. That's why David says in Psalm 37, it says, be still before the Lord and wait patiently on him. So that's one story, the story of Jairus and his daughter, recognizing how Jesus in the end did what the plan was all along. The second one that you're probably very familiar with is the story of Joseph, right? You find the story of Joseph in the book of Genesis. You're familiar with the guy with the multicolored coat, right? And the brothers and everything like that. Maybe you've seen a musical about it, okay? But it's in the Bible. And Joseph's an Old Testament story about a teenager who had all these brothers, and they were super jealous of him because of, he was the dad's favorite son. And so they sold him into slavery, and he gets carted off and sent to Egypt. And while he was there, he gets put in prison, wrongly accused, and all this type of stuff. Well, eventually, over all of these years, he makes himself, he rises up to be basically second in command in Egypt. And so he rises to this place of power of honestly, what is the very first world superpower and dynasty in Egypt. And then years and years later, I'm trying to recap this, it covers about 13 chapters in the book of Genesis, but years later, his family, because of a famine, is desperate for food. And so they show up in Egypt because Joseph was actually in charge of collecting food so that everybody could survive this famine. But his family, they didn't plan ahead. And so they show up not knowing that Joseph was going to be there. And when they see him, Joseph has the moment where he can either extract revenge on his brothers for what they did to him, or he could bless them. It was totally up to him, and no one would have known any different. But here's what he tells them. Genesis 50, verse 20. This is the climactic verse of how this all comes out. He says to his brothers, you intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. His perspective in the story came to recognize that even though there was a bad part of the journey, like a real bad part, okay? Sold as a slave, worked as a slave, got put in prison, all the bad things. Even in the midst of that, he believed that God had a plan. God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done. And if there's anything that we can learn from the story of Joseph, it's that sometimes the bad things that happen, they have a purpose that's worth it in the end. It's not that God orchestrated the bad. I don't want you to ever think that. But the bad can be redeemed for good. And that's exactly what we see in Joseph's story. But there's one more I want to highlight to you because I think it's really important. And that's the story of Paul. We're all familiar with Paul. He wrote almost most of the New Testament, but he was the premier evangelist in the New Testament. He traveled, he planted churches, he wrote letters to these churches, all of these things. But he also had a lot of issues along the way. He had a lot of people that didn't like him, even Jewish people. Paul was a Jew. And so as he started preaching the gospel and talking about Jesus as the Son of God, he encountered a lot of people who treated him really poorly. He was hurt, he was abused. They tried to stone him, kill him by throwing rocks at him. He got kicked out of towns and villages all the time. He was imprisoned, he was shipwrecked. Later, he was sentenced to house arrest, and eventually, he'd be beheaded by the Emperor Nero and killed. But in the midst of all these difficult things, while he's sitting in a Roman prison, he writes these words to the church in Philippi. He says this, look at these words. He says, "Now I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that what has happened to me," okay? Everything that's happened to me, all these terrible things, has actually served to advance the gospel. As a result, it has become clear throughout the whole palace guard and to everyone else that I am in chains for Christ. And because of my chains, the things that are making me in prison, because of them, most of the brothers and sisters have become confident in the Lord and dare all the more to proclaim the gospel without fear. Think about what he's saying here. He's saying that despite all of the terrible things that have happened to me, Paul didn't do, maybe he said some things wrong or, something like that, but he wasn't doing crimes. He wasn't doing anything bad. He was preaching Jesus. All the terrible things that have happened to me, all of them, all the threats, all the imprisonment, people tried to kill him, all of these things have served to advance the gospel. And on top of that, more people are actually willing to proclaim Jesus to others. Paul had a perspective that told him that it wasn't, even if it wasn't how he would have planned it, because listen, Paul would not have planned it that way. He would have not have planned people not liking him and kicking him out and trying to kill him and talking bad about him, all those types of things. Even though it's not how he planned it, God is using it to bring about good for others, and that was good enough for Paul. That was his perspective. And so, what I really want you to see and to feel and to hear tonight and to believe and to recognize is to live in a way that trusts God in the process. That's all I'm trying to highlight to you through these three stories. Because God has a perfect record of doing the right thing. He's a perfect record. He promises all of us that he has good plans for us. Even if every part of the journey isn't going to be exactly how, if I would say this is how my life is going to be, I wouldn't write my story and put a bunch of bad things in there. Okay? I put a bunch of good things and blessings and all the type of things. Even if it's not how we would have designed it, exactly how we think it should, it does not make God untrustworthy. That's what I want us to feel. God is good. We sang about this. The first song that we sang tonight, God is good. He loves you more than you can fathom. That love is exemplified over and over again every time we think about the life and the death and the resurrection of Jesus. Don't ever forget that Jesus went to the cross, suffered and endured a death that he did not deserve. Why? Because God has a plan for you, a good plan for us. That is what we hang on to. He has a purpose for you, but in the in-between, we can trust him, and you can fully trust God even when it doesn't make sense, even when it doesn't line up with your plans, even when it feels like it's bad. When you have this perspective, it lowers your stress, it lowers your anxiety, it lowers your worry, all of these things. So I'm going to tell you another story about Shelby and I so you can get to know us a little bit better, okay? So we started dating when we were juniors in high school. I don't know if you know this or not. So we were together for a long time. We broke up a couple times in high school, and so we broke up twice in high school. She broke up with me twice in high school is really how that went. It's really unfortunate for me, but she was real busy with sports and swimming, and I just wasn't that important. So I got dumped during swimming season a couple times. But, we got back together and everything like that. Well, the summer before we went off to college, so we had been together for, little over a year and a half up to that point. The summer before we left off to college, it was a real bad summer for us. I think we were both worried because we were going to different schools of how this was going to work and how it was going to end up. And we had a bad summer, and so I dumped her that summer, right? Yeah, that's right. She was treating me bad, so I dumped her. And so we went off to college, and we were not together. We were not dating. And we both kind of I went on a couple dates, and I think she only went on one. If she went on more than one, I don't know about it. So, but we both kind of explored different parts of, what it would be like to not be together. And we both almost instantly and collectively at the same time realized that we didn't want to be with anybody else. And even though that we had broken up and said that this is it, we still stayed in communication, and we eventually got back together even though we were at different colleges. And here's what I tell you. If I were to write my story about how Shelby and I dated and got married, I would not have included that we broke up 3 times and dated other people and stuff like that, right? That seems like that's not what you'd read in a love book, right? But in the midst of all of that, and it was difficult, definitely was difficult, long distance was difficult, all that kind of stuff, God helped us to realize that actually how much we do love each other and wanted to be together. And I just tell you that, I know it's like a perfect example, but sometimes there's purpose in the pain. Sometimes God is always at work behind the scenes, and we can trust God in all facets of life. And that's really what I want you to feel tonight. Even when the plans don't come together like we are thinking, we have to wait on Him and His timing. But equally important, I want to close with this, because this is different than what I've talked about already. Equally important is that while you wait on Him, like on His purpose or His plan or whatever it is, you can serve Him. And that's actually where I want your mind to go next. It's true that you may have a great purpose in life. Honestly, you might. I believe that you probably do. You're going to have a great purpose. That may be revealed to you now, may be revealed to you in 10 or 15 years, which are true and ultimate and God-given purposes in this life. I don't know when that's going to be revealed to you. For Joseph, it took a lifetime, honestly, to see what his purpose was. For Paul, it took several years for that to come together for him. For Jairus and his daughter, it was a matter of a day or a couple hours or whatever it is to see how God would be glorified. And all this, regardless of whether your purpose in life gets revealed to you right now or later, right now, because you can trust Him, you can choose to serve Him. You can find your purpose while you wait on your purpose. This is really what I'm trying to say. In fact, that's what I want you to remember tonight, is while you wait on God's purpose in your life, you can serve Him. You don't have to be in this roulette that's just I'll just wait for God to show me what He has for me. No, in the midst of the waiting, you can serve Him. Instead of waiting for God to do something for you, you can do something for Him. And in that, you will become who He wants you to become. And when you live like that, I truly believe that you will find your purpose, even if you're not looking for it.